Trump just raised the stakes on his tariff fight with one branch of government he doesn't control. The Supreme Court, in a late-night post, he warned that if the justices rule against his authority to impose broad import tariffs, it would be the biggest threat in history to United States national security and leave America financially defenseless compared to rivals already using tariffs of their own. When a president calls a court decision the greatest security risk in history, he's not just talking to judges, he's talking to markets, allies, adversaries, and every voter feeling inflation at the checkout line. I've seen presidents fight courts before, but rarely over something as fundamental as who controls the tax on every product crossing the border. In this case, Trump built his entire economic playbook around a 10% baseline tariff on most imports, layered on top of targeted duties aimed at countries like China, using a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. That statute was written for unusual external threats, sanctions, asset freezes, regulatory controls, not as a general-purpose revenue tool. Over 90 importers and a coalition of states have gone to the Court of International Trade, and ultimately the Supreme Court saying exactly that. Tariffs are Congress's job, and using emergency powers to tax almost everything is an overreach that violates both the law and the Constitution's separation of powers. The Supreme Court heard arguments in November, and the questions weren't friendly to the government. Several justices pressed Trump's lawyers on why, if Congress wanted to hand over a blank check on tariffs, they would have hidden it inside an emergency sanctions statute instead of writing it clearly. Justice Neil Gorsuch, among others, highlighted the danger. If you accept the administration's reading, every other tariff-granting law becomes pointless because the president could simply invoke IEEPA and impose any tariff at any time for any reason tied to a loosely defined threat. The government tried to salvage its case by arguing these tariffs are regulatory rather than revenue-raising, but that only raised more eyebrows. Regulators don't usually brag about how much cash their rules bring in, and Trump has repeatedly pointed to tariff revenue as proof his strategy works. That's the backdrop for his latest warning. Trump now insists that tariffs are the reason the U.S. is financially strongest in the world and that smart people understand it, arguing that without them, America couldn't respond effectively, while others, like the European Union, slap new duties on Chinese goods. He portrays tariffs as a fast, flexible tool that forces manufacturers to bring plants and data centers home, funds farm bailouts and tariff dividends, and gives Washington leverage over adversaries without sending troops. In his telling, a Supreme Court decision that declares his use of IEEPA unlawful wouldn't just be a legal defeat. It would disarm the country's economic weapons and turn the U.S. into a free trade pacifist in a world of mercantilist predators. Markets, however, don't trade on rhetoric alone. They look at the practical consequences. If the court rules that IEEPA doesn't authorize these tariffs, importers could be entitled to refunds on duties already paid, potentially tens of billions of dollars. That sounds like a windfall for some companies in the short term, but it creates chaos in government finances and uncertainty over which tariffs, if any, remain in force. More importantly, it forces the administration either to seek clear authority from Congress, a messy, politically costly process, or to hunt for another creative reading of existing law that looks less like a blank check. That's why Trump is emphasizing national security. It's an attempt to raise the political price the court would pay for clipping his wings. The investors who have been following this story know another layer. White House officials have already hinted they have different paths to keep tariffs going, even if they lose this particular case. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has talked about tariff structures being permanent or easily recreated under other statutes or through targeted national security findings. In other words, even if the court says no to this version of IEEPA tariffs, the administration believes it can rebuild much of the regime under different legal scaffolding. That undercuts Trump's apocalyptic warning, but it also feeds a deeper worry in markets that the legal basis may change, but the reality, structurally higher tariffs as a semi-permanent feature, will not. From a rule of law standpoint, this case is about more than trade. It's about whether emergency powers can be used as a backdoor to avoid Congress whenever a president wants a policy tool that's politically hard to legislate. EPA was never meant to be a general substitute for the tax code. Congress guards its tariff power jealously and has historically delegated it only in specific, constrained ways. If the court blesses a broad reading of IEEPA, it doesn't just give Trump power. It gives every future president a template to bypass Congress on tariffs, sanctions, send-style duties, and maybe other financial measures. If the court rejects that reading, it reasserts congressional control, but risks being painted, as Trump is already doing, as naive about global competition and responsible for any economic pain that follows. For ordinary Americans, the fight can feel abstract until they remember where tariffs show up in the price of imported goods, the cost of intermediate inputs for factories, the bill for a new car, or even the weekly grocery basket when tariffs hit agricultural products, fertilizer, or packaging. Trump frames all of that as necessary friction to rebuild domestic industry, saying tariffs pressured companies to build plants and data centers in the U.S. and funded aid to farmers. Critics counter that tariffs are just another layer of inflation on top of existing pressures, and that using emergency powers instead of negotiated trade laws makes the whole system feel unstable. Both can be right at the same time. Tariffs can spur some reshoring while also raising prices and uncertainty. Markets care less about who gets credit and more about whether the rules will be clear and durable enough for long-term planning. If you think like a cautious billionaire, you don't assume any one outcome. Instead, you map scenarios. Scenario one, the court upholds the core of Trump's approach, maybe with some limiting language, and the IEEPA tariffs mostly survive. That reinforces the message that the presidency has wide, fast-acting economic powers, and future presidents of both parties are likely to use them. Tariffs become a normalized instrument, not a temporary Trump anomaly. Scenario two, the court strikes down the tariffs or guts their legal foundation, forcing the administration back to Congress or into narrower tools. That would mean a messy transition period with legal uncertainty, refund claims, and a scramble to design replacement tools that pass constitutional muster. In that world, volatility, rises in trade exposed sectors, and international partners question whether U.S. trade policy is stable or court too dependent. There's also a hybrid scenario. The court issues a nuanced ruling that curtails some uses of IEPA while leaving room for more targeted national security tariffs that could preserve some leverage while forcing Washington to be more honest about what is truly a security threat versus what is simply economic protectionism. It might also push Congress to clarify the law, a heavy lift in a polarized environment, but not impossible when both parties realize they might want to say over the next president's tools. In all scenarios, the message to investors is the same. Trade policy is no longer a sleepy bipartisan consensus. It's a contested battlefield at the very top of the legal system. Trump's rhetoric about dark and sinister forces in America being financially defenseless if he loses is crafted for his base. But it also has an unintended side effect. It reminds everyone that a huge amount of current economic strategy is concentrated in one man's interpretation of one emergency law. Concentration of power is efficient, right up until it isn't. When a single court ruling can, in theory, flip billions of dollars in duties and reroute supply chains, that tells you the system is overly dependent on legal gray zones. Long-term capital prefers clearer lanes. Either Congress authorizes a durable tariff framework or it doesn't. Running a multi-trillion-dollar economy off emergency switches was always going to invite a constitutional collision. It has now arrived. So how should you position yourself as this case approaches its decision? First, recognize that tariff risk is now structural, not temporary. Even if this specific IEPA approach is struck down, the political appetite for tariffs as a tool, both for revenue and leverage, isn't going away. Second, reduce exposure to business models that only work under one narrow tariff regime. If your investment thesis assumes a permanent 10% blanket tariff that no court or Congress will ever touch, you're not investing. You're betting on one legal outcome. Third, look for companies and sectors that can adapt across regimes, those with diversified sourcing, strong pricing power, and the ability to move production or pass costs without losing their customer base. Finally, don't let the drama distract you from the underlying lesson. A healthy system can tolerate courts pushing back on executives sounding alarms about national security, and legislators arguing over who should hold the tariff pen. The danger isn't tension. It's pretending there's no tension while quietly stretching emergency laws to cover everything. This Supreme Court case and Trump's reaction to it is forcing the country to answer a basic question: do we want trade policy written in statutes after deliberation, or improvised under emergency banners because it's faster? However you feel about Trump or tariffs, your answer to that question will shape how you see what happens when the court finally rules.